Clara stood in her kitchen, the dull hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet like static in her ears. Her eyes rested on the yellow post-it, its curled corner peeling from the cold metal door. She'd written it months ago in her neat looping script, Surgery, June 10th. Just below it, a second note in bolder ink. Don't forget to fast after midnight. It had been there so long it had become part of the kitchen's landscape, like the chipped tile near the stove or the cracked glass above the sink. Familiar, inevitable. The envelope came on a Thursday. Heavy cardstock, the kind that felt like it should carry something momentous, something kind. Clara sat at the kitchen table, hands working carefully through the seal, wondering if it was a delayed birthday card, maybe a letter from a friend. She hadn't expected an RSVP card with gold-foiled edges and her son's name, Graham and Tessa, etched in elegant cursive. She stared at the date. June 10th. At first, she blinked hard, recalibrated, thought it was a misprint, maybe a typo, maybe someone had sent her the wrong card. She even smiled, just a little, at the absurdity. But when she called Tessa to clarify, to ask politely about the error, the response landed like sleet on warm skin. "We couldn't find another venue," Tessa said, her voice clipped and resolute. "Everything else was booked or too expensive. This was the only day that made sense." Clara paused. The words knocked the breath out of her. Not because of what was said, but how. Tessa's voice lacked hesitation, any hint of apology. It was pure logistics, cold math. Not a shred of awareness that Clara's name, her date, her recovery had been known, intimately, repeatedly, and clearly, for months. She had told them after the first consult in February, sent the group text with the confirmed surgery date in March, mentioned it again over dinner in April when they dropped by after church. The words weren't lost in passing. She'd said them plainly. "I'll be out of commission for a while. June 10th, hip surgery, it's major." Now she couldn't help but replay those moments, the silence that followed her reminders. How Tessa nodded absently, how Graham changed the subject. She hadn't understood it then, but now it made sense. Those silences weren't forgetfulness. They were dismissal. She had been telling them something vital, and they had been choosing not to hear her. "It wasn't just the date," Clara whispered aloud now, fingers tracing the RSVP card's sharp edge. "It was the decision not to ask." That was what kept her awake that night. Not the betrayal of the day itself, but the quiet, arrogant assumption that her presence was optional, that her son could plan his wedding and not even consider the collision, that she could be told, not invited into the decision, that a FaceTime screen would be enough. She tried to imagine what would have happened if roles were reversed, if she had scheduled her surgery on their wedding day, the uproar, the guilt, the urgent rescheduling. But here, in her world, there was only her voice echoing in her own head, and an RSVP card with a cruel kind of finality. Her chest tightened with the familiar ache of invisibility, not the sudden pain of injury, but the long, dull erosion of presence. It had been happening for years, the shift from central figure to background character in her son's life. She'd chalked it up to adulthood, independence, the natural growing distance. But this was not distance. It was deletion. In the days that followed, Clara found herself moving through her house with a different kind of quiet. She cleaned out the guest room that no one stayed in anymore, folded linens with exact corners, prepared meals and left them untouched. Everything took on the stillness of a vigil, not for death, but for the recognition she would not receive. Friends called, some out of habit, some because they'd heard about the wedding date. "That can't be right," one friend, Nancy, said. "He wouldn't do that, not knowing your surgery's that day." Clara just smiled. He did. The RSVPs flooded social media, people tagging locations, rehearsing dances, showing off dresses. She didn't respond, didn't like, didn't comment. She waited for Graham to call, to explain, to soften the blow. But when he finally did, it was almost worse than silence. "Look, Mom," he said, voice already weary, "we had 100 things to juggle. And it's not like you're being cut out. We'll send someone to FaceTime you. You won't miss a thing." That was the moment something hard and sharp lodged behind her ribs. She almost laughed. Won't miss a thing. As if a virtual glimpse of his vows could fill the space of standing beside him. As if pixels could substitute for presence. As if she hadn't spent 34 hours in labor to bring him into this world, and now he couldn't spend 10 minutes seeing if she'd be able to stand in hers. After he hung up, Clara didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stood in her kitchen again, staring at those post-it notes like they were written in a language no one in her family could read. She didn't tear up the RSVP card. She placed it carefully back into the envelope and set it on the mantel, a monument to erasure, a reminder that you can love someone with every inch of yourself, raise them through fevers and failures, hold their head when they cry, and still end up sidelined when it really counts. The morning of June 10th arrived quiet and gray. Clara lay in the hospital bed, dressed in pale blue and tethered to wires and beeping machines. She watched the clock. Somewhere, music was playing, champagne was poured, a dress zipped up, and her son stood waiting for someone to walk him down the aisle. It wouldn't be her. A nurse adjusted her IV and asked softly, "Do you have anyone with you?" Clara offered a gentle, tired smile. "No," she said. "Just me today." And she meant it. Not just physically, but wholly. Just her. Not invisible, but alone. And there, in that sterile room, she faced a different kind of healing. Not just the bones of her hip, but the bruises left by love unreciprocated, by the silence after sacrifice. Clara would recover. She'd walk again, maybe even dance again. But she would never forget this date. Not because of the pain, but because of what it proved. That love can endure, even when acknowledgement doesn't. That some wounds don't bleed, but they ache all the same. And that sometimes the deepest hurt comes not from a blow, but from not being asked. The hum of the IV pump pulsed softly, steady as breath. Clara lay propped in the hospital bed, her skin pale under the sterile overhead light. Her body felt foreign, heaviness where there should be fluidity, stillness where once there was urgency. Morphine made everything quiet but vivid. Thoughts came in waves, memories unspooling like ribbons from a worn cassette. She wasn't in the hospital anymore. Not really. She was 29 again, fingers raw from bleach and antiseptic, a double shift behind her and Graham asleep in the break room cot, wrapped in a blanket she'd begged from an orderly. The ER had overflowed that night. 4-car pileup, 2 cardiac arrests. And still she left only when she'd clocked out, clutching her son with aching arms, whispering, "I'm right here, baby. I've got you." Those years blurred into each other. Packing lunches at 4 a.m., sewing loose buttons in stairwells, falling asleep beside his crib still in her scrubs. After David's heart attack, so sudden, so final, Clara didn't pause. She mourned on the move. Worked overtime, swallowed grief in between patient charts, paid the mortgage, bought Graham new shoes before he asked. Her love language had always been provision, not poetry, action, not adornment. Did he ever know that? She saw him again in her mind, college freshman, face closed like a locked door. Their phone calls were short. Updates, not conversations. "It's good, Mom. Busy. I've got it." She offered care packages, visits he politely declined, her voice always one layer too warm, too eager. He withdrew with the quiet precision of someone who didn't want to be rude but needed distance like air. That's when the guilt began to grow roots. Did I love him wrong, she wondered? Did I mother him so completely that I forgot to simply see him? It wasn't that she didn't try. Birthdays with his favorite cake, open-door policy, listening through adolescent silence, trying not to push. But he kept stepping back, and eventually she learned to stop stepping forward. Now, the tablet on the rolling tray showed a frozen image of a wedding altar, floral arch, sun-dappled chairs, people finding their seats. The live stream was muted, a digital performance happening in real time. She watched it like a stranger. Ray entered the room with her usual windstorm energy, mouth already halfway through a sentence. "I swear, Clara, if one more nurse says, 'Isn't that lovely?' while pointing to that screen, I'm going to pull their plug." Clara managed a dry smile. "It's fine. Really." Ray narrowed her eyes. "No, it's not. And you don't have to say it is." She sat down with a rustle of her denim jacket, crossing her arms. Ray had always been the one who said what Clara wouldn't. They were two halves of a single defense system, Clara the peacemaker, Ray the avenger. "He didn't forget, Clara," Ray said, voice low and hard. "He prioritized performance over presence. That's worse." Clara blinked slowly. "He probably thought—" "No," Ray cut her off. "Stop making excuses for him. You told him, repeatedly. He chose spectacle over substance. Chose to be seen by 100 people instead of showing up for the one who raised him. The words hung there, sharp as glass. Clara looked back at the tablet. People were seated now. Tessa appeared, radiant and poised, bouquet clutched in one hand. Graham was at the altar, adjusting his cuffs. The breeze moved his hair like Clara used to when he was sick, brushing his bangs back so he could breathe easier. Her stomach twisted. "He looks like David," she murmured. "In the eyes." Ray didn't respond. She stared at the screen, something hardening in her expression. Clara let her head rest against the pillow. "I keep wondering if I failed him, if I was more nurse than mother." Ray scoffed. "You kept him alive. You kept him safe. Don't mistake survival for neglect. You didn't fail him. He failed you." Silence, then a shift. Ray pulled out her phone, thumbs working fast. A pause, then a curse under her breath. Clara lifted her head. "What?" "The venue?" Ray said slowly. "It's in Arrow Glen." Clara blinked. "That's not—" "It is," Ray snapped. "The same damn resort. The one you took him to after David's funeral. When you could barely stand upright but said he needed to see something beautiful. You saved up for 6 months for that weekend. He was what, 10? Clara's blood felt like ice in her veins. She remembered it all at once. The quiet lake, the morning pancakes, the way Graham had clung to her in the pool, and whispered, "I'm glad we came, Mom." She'd chosen that place to prove to him that life still had light in it, even after loss. And now, he'd chosen it for something else. Something layered, symbolic. A wedding, in the same place where she once built a shelter out of grief. "He rewrote it," Clara whispered. "He overwrote our memory with his." Ray stood. "Number he buried yours." The tablet screen flickered as the ceremony began. Clara watched Graham take Tessa's hand, watched as mouths moved in vows she couldn't hear. Her chest ached, not from the surgery, not from the scar, but from the clarity. She had spent her life showing up, without being asked, without applause. And here she was, recovering alone, offered a screen instead of a seat, a live stream instead of a life. "He made a choice," Clara said quietly, voice sharper now. "So will I." Ray leaned in, as if waiting for instructions. "I won't chase him anymore," Clara continued. "I won't soften what he's hardened. If he wants a life where I'm a footnote, that's his right, but I don't have to write myself into the margins." The IV beeped, signaling its cycle complete. The nurse returned, adjusted her medication. Clara felt the tug of drowsiness, the edge of sleep folding around her. But it wasn't the dazed confusion of earlier. This time it was clarity under anesthesia. The knowledge that wounds don't just happen in the flesh, they happen in the forgetting. She let her eyes close as vows were spoken without her, a past rewritten in her absence. But she wouldn't be invisible. Not anymore. When she woke next, the screen would be dark, the wedding over, the pain receding. But the decision, her choice, would remain, pulsing steady beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. She had done her part. Now, it was time to stop proving it. The living room was quiet in the late afternoon, shadows stretching long across the carpet. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor, a box of old photo albums beside her, dust curling in the sunbeams like smoke. The television was off. The tablet too. Wedding over. Applause concluded. She was left only with the echo of it all and the remnants of a life she had spent trying to build one heartbeat at a time. The album cover cracked as she opened it, faux leather fraying at the corners. The first photo stared up at her. Graham, age 3, his mouth open mid-laugh, eyes bright beneath a mop of messy curls. Her hand hovered there, brushing lightly over the image. She remembered that day clearly. Thunder had roared all morning, and Graham had refused to let go of her coat, fingers balled into its hem like it was a lifeline. He'd always hated storms. The sound, the unpredictability, the way the sky turned on you without warning. Clara would pull him into her lap, whisper nonsense into his ear, wrap him in the blanket they called the cloud. That was the name he gave it. Soft and thick, the safest place he knew. Back then, he let her hold him. She turned the page. More pictures, each like a stitch in a quilt she hadn't realized she was sewing. Birthday candles, missing teeth, report cards proudly held up for the camera. All of it suspended in amber. Between the pages, small scraps of memory hid. A dried flower from his second-grade play, a smudged drawing of their house, hospital discharge papers folded in quarters, tucked inside as if even in pride there had been emergency. Beside the photo box sat an old shoebox filled with bills, hospital statements, co-pays, receipts from nights she had spent more time with machines than people. Evidence of survival. Proof that she'd shown up, over and over, even when her own bones ached and her eyes burned from sleepless nights. But in all that showing up, what had she failed to show? Her fingers rested on a picture of Graham at 12, taken during a camping trip. He smiled stiffly, his shoulders hunched as though he didn't know where to place himself. That was around the time his voice changed and the distance began. He'd started closing his bedroom door more often. Stopped asking for help with homework. She'd assumed it was normal. Puberty. Independence. But now she wondered, was that the beginning of the retreat? The moment he began constructing a life where she was welcome only in emergencies, not celebrations? She whispered to the silence, "Did I raise a son, or a soldier in the war against vulnerability?" The front door creaked open, and Ruth entered without knocking, as usual. She carried a paper bag and a soft look that barely masked the fury she still felt about the wedding. "Brought soup," she said, "because that's what old women do when life punches you in the teeth." Clara smiled faintly. "Thank you." Ruth was the kind of friend who never needed an invitation. A retired social worker, decades of insight etched into the folds of her face. She had once talked an armed teenager down from a rooftop and still believed most pain could be softened if someone simply stayed. She glanced at the albums. "Ghosts?" she asked. Clara nodded. "The kind that show up in smiles and storm clouds." Ruth set the bag down and joined her on the floor, knees cracking as she crossed her legs. "You know," she said gently, "kids raised in chaos often confuse silence with safety." Clara looked up. "You never modeled softness," Ruth continued, not unkindly. "You modeled strength, dignified, sacrificial strength, but silence too. A locked jaw, a full calendar. He never saw you cry." "I couldn't afford to cry," Clara murmured. "I know," Ruth said, "but maybe he needed to see that it was safe to cry. That softness wasn't a luxury, that it was part of survival too." Clara exhaled, slow and deliberate. She glanced again at the pictures, then at her hands, so often used to suture, to scrub, to lift, to hold, but rarely to simply comfort without a task behind it. Her mind flashed to her mother, Margaret, her clipped speech, her obsession with posture and perfection. Nothing was ever good enough. "Chin up," she'd say when Clara came home crying. "No one respects a girl who falls apart." And so Clara never did. She earned her praise by being unshakable. Top of her class, the first to offer help, the last to cry. She'd sworn she'd be nothing like Margaret. And yet, in trying to be the opposite, had she simply passed the same message through a different filter? "I wore strength like armor," she whispered, but maybe he saw it as a wall. Ruth didn't respond immediately. She pulled a photo from the album. Graham at 5, holding a wooden sword, cape billowing behind him in the yard. "He was already pretending to be brave back then," she said, "and you taught him how to survive. But did you ever teach him how to stay soft while surviving?" Clara felt the truth settle like dust in her lungs. She had given him everything: food, stability, a future. But she hadn't shown him what to do with pain that wasn't productive. She'd taught him to patch wounds, not to name them, to move forward, but not to sit in sorrow and let it speak. She looked around the room. The guest list of ghosts was long. David's absence, her mother's harshness, every patient she'd lost and didn't have time to mourn. And now Graham, not dead, not gone, but distant in a way that made her feel like she was mourning someone still living. Clara closed the album gently, hands trembling. "I never modeled softness, just strength dressed as silence." Ruth reached over and touched her hand. "Then start now. There's still time. Not to change the past, but maybe to stop passing it forward." They sat together for a while in the hush of late afternoon, the soup forgotten, the weight of history thick in the air. Outside, thunder rolled distantly. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't brace. She sat still. And for the first time in years, she let herself feel everything. The wheels of the rental van hissed against the circular drive as Clara's reflection flickered across the grand glass doors of Arrow Glen Resort. She shifted slightly in the wheelchair, hands folded over the soft cotton of her lap blanket. The surgery scar throbbed in subtle protest, but she didn't flinch. Not today. Ray stepped out first, throwing her denim jacket over one shoulder like she was entering a courtroom instead of a luxury retreat. Ruth emerged behind her, a slow dignity in every movement, her cane tapping rhythmically against the stone walkway. "You sure about this?" Ray asked, adjusting Clara's footrests. "If I'm being cut out," Clara said, her voice calm, "I might as well choose the view." Inside, the cool hush of wealth and hospitality blanketed everything. The staff looked up, brows furrowing in polite confusion. A man in a fitted blazer, a manager maybe, whispered to a woman in heels holding a clipboard too tightly. Clara recognized her immediately. The wedding planner, whose smile now teetered on a wire of obligation and alarm. "Mrs. Langston," she said carefully, stepping forward. "We weren't expecting—" "I'm not here for the wedding," Clara interrupted, tone even. "I booked a suite for recovery." The planner opened her mouth to protest, then reconsidered. "Of course, right this way." The suite was on the third floor, just across from the grand ballroom. Clara insisted on keeping the curtains open, the gold-draped doors of the venue visible from her position in bed. It wasn't pettiness. Not really. It was reclamation. A quiet kind of resistance. Ruth sat at the small writing desk, flipping through a pamphlet of spa services. Ray paced like a caged animal. Clara reached for her phone and tapped the number she'd saved from the nurse's discharge packet. Dr. Howard, Recovery Counseling. She hadn't planned on calling so soon. But something about the sterile kindness of the hotel room, the gilded reminder of where she wasn't wanted, pressed against a deeper place. "Clara?" A warm voice answered on the second ring. "Dr. Howard here." She expected formality. Instead, she got presence, like someone folding a blanket at the foot of your bed without asking. "I don't know why I'm calling," Clara began. "Because healing isn't linear," Dr. Howard said gently. "And sometimes recovery means defining what hurt you beyond the body." Clara closed her eyes. "I came here to see, to feel it." "Then feel it. You don't need to justify pain. You only need to acknowledge it." Outside, a group of guests gathered under string lights, laughter rising like distant music. Clara ended the call with gratitude. Dr. Howard's voice stayed in the room long after he hung up. Later, she wheeled herself to the cracked balcony and listened. Voices carried from the ballroom, rehearsal toasts, people raising glasses, polished speeches echoing through the night. "To family," someone said, voice reverent, false. "To the ones who held us up." Laughter followed, applause. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not jealousy, not even betrayal this time. Just grief, measured and hollow. A grieving for things misrepresented, for a narrative rewritten while she sat inches away. She turned back inside, hands trembling slightly as she reached for a framed photograph left on the suite's nightstand. A generic print, sailboats on a calm lake. She thought briefly of replacing it with one of her own. Maybe the photo of Graham on his first day of kindergarten, clutching her hand so tight his knuckles turned white. Broken things we frame. Maybe to remember, maybe to rewrite, or maybe to pretend they were never broken at all. She didn't sleep that night, just watched the ballroom lights shimmer like distant stars through her window. The next morning brought quiet movement outside her door. Florists, catering trays, bridesmaids in silk robes and swollen egos. Ruth went downstairs to get coffee. Ray refused to leave her post. "I hope she chokes on her own vows," Ray muttered, peering through the curtain. Clara smirked, then immediately winced. Her body reminded her that rage, however righteous, had physical costs. But it wasn't the wedding that brought the final rupture. It was the hallway. Ruth had stepped out for ice. Clara had sent Ray down for fresh towels. For the first time in hours, she was alone in the suite. The voices came from the hallway. Laughter, steps, then the unmistakable tone of Tessa. "And now she's here," Tessa scoffed. "Like she owns the place. Booked a suite across from the ballroom. The gilt card queen, front row seat to the show." Laughter followed. The sharp, brittle kind. Clara didn't move, didn't speak. Just sat in her chair, pulse steady, lips pressed into a line of quiet devastation. Not even the decency of whispering. So that was how Tessa framed her. Not as a mother, not even as an obstacle, as a manipulator, a caricature, a symbol of outdated martyrdom. Clara inhaled, slow and deep, until the sound passed, until their footsteps vanished down the hall like ghosts who didn't know they haunted. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She closed the curtain. Recovery, Dr. Howard had said, is what you define it to be. Maybe this was part of it. The witnessing, the reckoning, the clarity that burns more than it soothes. Clara sat with it. And then she began to write. Not to Graham, not yet, to herself. A list titled, What I Gave, What I Won't Give Again. And across from the ballroom, she began to reclaim what they thought she wouldn't fight for, her presence, her truth, her right to name the pain and not apologize for it. The light from the hallway spilled in each time the elevator doors opened. Bridesmaids laughing, clinking glasses, the faint rustle of formal wear being adjusted and admired. Clara sat in her recovery suite, wrapped in a shawl Ray had brought up earlier, her body aching in quiet rebellion. The ballroom across the hall pulsed with celebration, every burst of applause a small fracture in her composure. The rehearsal dinner had started hours ago, but no one knocked. No voice said her name. She had asked Ruth to help her to the edge of the mezzanine earlier, to watch, not from defiance, but from the distance she now understood she occupied in Graham's life. They'd found a quiet alcove near the service elevators. She could see through the crack of the ballroom's arched doors. Graham, handsome in navy, his smile timed to applause, his hand light on Tessa's back. The toast Tessa gave was a performance of love. Jokes rehearsed, family praised. Clara's name was not mentioned. The planner passed her in the hall at one point, flustered. "Oh, Mrs. Langston, I didn't realize you were still up here." The implication was clear, still present. Clara nodded, her voice unused. Still healing. Inside her suite, the tablet buzzed softly with an untouched message from the resort spa. Complimentary aromatherapy session. She ignored it. Pain needed more than lavender to be soothed. She wheeled herself back to the desk. The journal sat open to a blank page. The pen, weighty and blue, rolled slightly before she caught it. She wrote slowly, deliberately. She wasn't writing to anyone. Not really, just carving truth into silence. Some mothers give away their names to make room for their son's future, and some sons forget who built the ground they stand on. She stared at the words, her chest tight. She didn't cry. The tears had dried somewhere between the ballroom laughter and the silence of her suite. Instead, she turned the page. This time she wrote a letter to her younger self. Dear Clara, you tried. That day in your wedding dress, creased, a little too big, your mother pulling the veil tighter than necessary. You said yes to a life you didn't choose. You wore sacrifice like a second skin. And when David died, you didn't mourn. You managed. You poured love into Graham with everything you had, and you never asked to be seen, but you deserved to be seen. She paused, hand shaking, then continued. I wish I could tell you love should not require vanishing, that mothering should never mean becoming invisible. The ink blurred slightly where her grip faltered. She exhaled slow and long, then turned the page again. This one she labeled simply, For Graham. She hesitated. Then she began. You won't read this. That's not the point. This is for the echoes inside me that keep shouting your name when you've already turned away. I loved you so fiercely, I forgot to teach you that love includes noticing. That strength is not the absence of need. I didn't ask you to care for me because I thought protecting you meant keeping the weight off your shoulders. But in doing so, I taught you to look away when I staggered. I raised you to stand tall. But I should have also taught you to kneel beside the fallen. She set the pen down. Her hand ached, but the ache felt honest. Clara closed the journal gently and looked around the room. It was a suite meant for rest, but it had become a sanctuary for reckoning. She thought back to her own wedding, a rushed affair, pressed together by obligation and her mother's incessant demands. Simple is best, don't make it about yourself. The reception had been catered in the community center gym. The music cut short when the power failed. David had smiled through it all, sweet and distant, already working long hours. She remembered wondering, even as she walked down the aisle, if love was something you earned through endurance. Now, watching her son's polished world from afar, she saw a mirror, not of affection, but performance. Gestures made hollow through omission. A lineage of appearances kept intact by generations too afraid to break the frame. And yet, in this space, surrounded by absence, Clara had begun to name things. She wrote one final note, this time untitled. I was never invited into your vows. Not in the venue, not in the language, not in the planning. But I was present in every unpaid bill that kept your school shoes dry. I was present in the night shifts and canceled holidays. I was the vow you never noticed, the one that said, he will not go without. So I won't attend the ceremony tomorrow. Not because I wasn't invited, but because I've stopped asking to be. She folded the letter, placed it inside the front pocket of her journal, and leaned back. Outside, the laughter resumed. Glasses clinked, music swelled. Inside, Clara listened to her own silence, not as absence, but as answer. The hallway hummed with low music and drifting perfumes. Clara sat in her suite, a book untouched on her lap, the journal open beside her like a second pulse. Ray had left 20 minutes ago, Storm carried in her stride, promising nothing but honesty. Ruth stayed behind, saying only, she's not going to yell for the sake of yelling. She's going to say what you won't. Clara nodded. She didn't need to be present to feel the weight of what Ray was about to deliver. But the walls at Arrow Glen were thin, thinner still when emotion cracked the air. She heard the door open down the hall. A pause. Then Ray's voice, sharp but low. You're not a husband, Ray began, if you bury your mother alive in your milestones. A silence followed by the shuffle of feet. Clara imagined Graham, shoulders drawn, jaw set the way it always was when he felt accused. The way David's had looked once, in a kitchen argument Clara never recounted to anyone. Some defenses were generational. I just wanted a day that wasn't about her, Graham said. His voice cracked on just, as if he'd rehearsed the line but hadn't expected the sting. Clara froze. The words settled like dust on her skin. Not shouted, not venomous, just tired, quietly cruel. Ray didn't answer at first. Then with surgical clarity, so you erased her. Another silence. The sound of a throat clearing, a chair scraping, maybe a hand dragging down a face in guilt or frustration. I couldn't win with her, Graham muttered. Everything was always weighted. Every choice had history attached. And so you gave her absence, Ray said. You made her a ghost in the one place she helped you reach. Clara didn't move from the couch. She reached for the pen and wrote, he didn't just leave me out. He resented me in the story he's trying to rewrite. She let the words sit on the page, uncorrected, unsoftened. They didn't need to be refined. They needed to be real. The door creaked behind her. Ruth returned carrying 2 teas and the kind of silence that meant she knew more than she was letting on. She sat down beside Clara and passed her one of the cups. Chamomile. No fanfare. I heard him, Clara said quietly. And I'm not angry. I'm rewritten, Ruth sighed. I need to tell you something. Clara looked up. It's about the speech, Ruth continued. I asked one of the servers what he said. I was curious. You know what he opened with? Clara's breath stalled. My mother once told me, Ruth recited, that the hardest part of being strong is doing it alone. He talked about you like you were a lighthouse, quoted you, named your sacrifices, said he was who he was because of you. Clara blinked. Ruth continued, voice steady. He used your name like an inheritance, Clara. Wove your words into his love story, said you were the foundation, and then he never walked across the hall. The tea trembled in Clara's hands. She set it down. She was a story, a tribute, an anecdote for applause. He had framed her, not the real her, but a polished silhouette of her endurance, the mother as myth, strong but distant, revered but not included, second-hand. That was what it meant, she realized. She'd been made into a second-hand mother, someone passed around in praise but never present in practice. Good enough to quote, too heavy to invite. She felt sick. Later she would speak with Dr. Howard again. He would say, this pain has shape. Draw it, frame it, set it down. But in that moment, Clara reached again for the journal and sketched, not words this time, but a frame, a rectangle, empty in the center. Around it she scribbled, what they remember, what they avoid, what they reshape. The pen hovered. Then she wrote beneath it simply, "I was never meant to be part of the picture, just the brush they painted it with." Outside, laughter burst from the ballroom. The music swelled again. Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she closed the journal. Let them dance. She had already learned to sit still in the truth. The air in the lobby was cool and perfumed with eucalyptus and rosewater, a manufactured kind of calm that Clara had come to recognize as the signature of places that wanted guests to feel pampered, not present. She had wheeled herself down that morning, alone, more out of instinct than plan. Her body still ached in quiet pulses, but movement was beginning to feel like its own kind of protest. She'd meant only to sit near the glass wall and sip her coffee while the ballroom cleared of its last traces of the reception. But then she saw the portraits, newly framed, already mounted, lined up on easels along the long hallway leading to the elevators. The resort had wasted no time, offering the newlyweds a private exhibit of their own curated legacy. Clara approached them slowly, her wheels silent on the tile. The first frame held the standard image: Graham and Tessa at the altar, faces flushed with joy, bathed in late spring light. Another showed them dancing, her veil caught mid-air like a whisper. The photographer had captured beauty, no doubt, but also omission. And then came the third portrait, a family shot. Graham, standing beside Tessa's aunt, Eileen, her hand lightly on his shoulder, smiling like a woman who'd spent decades raising him. There was no caption, but the implication hung heavy. She stood in the place traditionally held for a mother. The image had been edited with subtle precision. Even the background blur had been smoothed out to highlight their closeness. Clara reached out and touched the glass, not to smear it, not to protest it, but to feel, in real time, what grief made of pride. Her hand rested there, fingers gentle on the cold surface. She smiled, not with bitterness, but with the aching warmth of someone who sees clearly, at last. A young couple passed behind her, murmuring appreciatively at the images. "She looks like such a proud mom," the woman said of Eileen. Clara didn't correct her. She didn't flinch, just waited until the couple moved on and sat quietly on a nearby bench, letting the moment settle. Ruth found her 10 minutes later. "Don't get up," Ruth said, even though Clara hadn't moved. "I've got news. You ready?" Clara looked up, her expression composed but alert. "I'm throwing a countergathering," Ruth said, eyes gleaming. "Here, in your suite, tonight." Clara blinked. "A what?" "A gathering," Ruth clarified. "For all the women at this wedding who were too complicated, too political, too real to be allowed front row. And I've invited a few of my own." Clara's brows lifted. "Ruth, don't try to stop me. Ray's already on board. She's bringing wine. And Greta. You remember Greta from your nursing unit? She's driving up. Turns out her niece was at the wedding too and stormed out when she saw how they edited you out of the photos." Clara laughed then, the sound rich and surprising in her throat. "You planned a revolution." "I planned a reclamation," Ruth said, smug, small, fierce female. That evening, the suite transformed. Pillows moved from beds to floor, chairs rearranged into a circle, tea lights flickering in old coffee mugs. Women came in twos and threes, some from the wedding, eyes bright with shared indignation, others who hadn't been part of it at all but knew Clara from other seasons of life. Nurses, neighbors, a librarian who used to share poetry with Clara at the park. They came with bottles of wine, boxes of tea, tins of cookies half-eaten by grandchildren. Ray managed the playlist, Motown with sudden drops into 80s ballads. Ruth moderated like a seasoned host, greeting each guest with a kiss on the cheek and a whispered, "Welcome to the real celebration." Clara sat in her wheelchair at first, then transitioned to the love seat with Ruth's help. Her laughter returned in waves, not polite chuckles, but real, rooted joy. They told stories about hard births and botched casseroles, about grief that arrived too soon, and husbands who stayed too long. One woman pulled a photo from her purse of her mother, who had died in a care home alone during the pandemic. "They put someone else's daughter in the slideshow," she said. "My name wasn't even listed." Heads nodded, hands reached across laps, a communion without altar. In the lull that followed, Clara felt a rising hum in her chest. Not adrenaline, not pain, language. She turned to Ruth. "Do you have that recorder still? The one from the writing group?" Ruth grinned and pulled it from her purse like it had been waiting. Clara held it with both hands for a moment, then clicked it on. She began, "Chapter 1. I was not erased. I was reframed by someone who didn't understand that strength without presence is not a virtue. It's a void. The room quieted, but no one left. She continued, her voice steady. I raised a son. I paid in blood and time. I asked for nothing in return but a name on the guest list. I didn't get it, so I'm writing myself back in. The recorder clicked softly with every syllable. Clara dictated not with rage, but with restoration. A memoir not for shelves, but for survival. Later, as the party wound down, someone whispered, "This felt more like a wedding than theirs did." Clara didn't disagree. She lay in bed that night, the recorder beside her, filled with the beginning of something true. The portraits downstairs still bore her absence. But in her suite, there were stories with her name stitched into every sentence, and those couldn't be edited out. The morning after Ruth's counter-gathering, the suite still carried the scent of candle wax and citrus tea. Clara moved slowly, more from muscle memory than pain, tidying scattered pillows and empty mugs, folding the evidence of last night's rebellion into soft corners. A different kind of ceremony had occurred here, quiet, uninvited, but unmistakably sacred. By mid-morning, the door was propped open with a bookend, and Ray had set out a tray of croissants and strong hotel coffee. Ruth returned with a small Bluetooth speaker, vintage-style, wood-paneled, and music floated through the room. Nina Simone, Ella Fitzgerald, a touch of Etta James. The sound curled into the hallway like incense, warm and unbothered. Clara perched in the chair by the window, wrapped in her wool shawl, her journal open in her lap. She didn't plan this next moment. It simply grew, like ivy from the cracks. Ruth placed a stack of letters in the center of the coffee table. "Let's read each other in," she said, like a writer's room, only with more grace. They took turns reading. Some read letters to children who no longer called. Some to spouses lost in quiet grief. Ray, surprisingly soft, read one to the girl she once was, angry, brave, always waiting for someone to come back. The concierge knocked gently near noon. "Heard you had the best party of the weekend," he said with a shy smile. Clara laughed and waved him in. "We're serving honesty and caffeine." He entered, eyes kind. "I lost my mother last winter. She never made it to see my first promotion. So I get it. How it feels to want someone in the room who deserved to be there." Clara didn't speak right away. She touched his wrist lightly in passing. No platitudes, just presence. Other staff trickled in. Housekeeping, a young front desk clerk who'd grown up with a single mom. No one stayed long, but every person left something behind. A story, a tear, a quote scrawled on a napkin. The suite became a second reception, one rooted not in spectacle, but in sincerity. By afternoon, laughter began echoing into the hallway. Guests passing by paused, curious. The music stayed soft but persistent, memory in motion. Clara's voice found her again as she wrote, "I may not be in the photos, but I'm still in the frame. Because this is what the frame really holds. Grace gathered in broken places, love unspoken, but not undone. The architecture of those left behind, building a room with a view and calling it survival." She set the pen down, the ache in her hip sharp but familiar. She welcomed it now, part of her, not the enemy. The body, like the heart, carried its stories in bone and bruise. Just before sunset, a tall woman in slacks and a navy blazer knocked on the open door. She held a folder and a hesitant smile. "Clara Langston?" she asked. "Yes," Clara replied, surprised. "I'm Maya Roth, venue director. I used to work in critical care, 10 years in an ICU before I moved into event management. I heard parts of your story from our staff, from a nurse friend who came to your gathering." Clara straightened, unsure. "I wanted to offer something," Maya continued. "We host artist residencies here between events, usually writers, sometimes painters. I oversee the schedule. I can block a week for you, fully comped, a suite, meals, space to write, heal, reflect, no conditions." Clara blinked. "You don't have to say yes," Maya added. "But I thought, maybe you deserve to be here in a way that's yours." For the first time in days, Clara felt a deep, untethered silence inside her. Not empty, spacious. "Thank you," she said softly. "Yes." As the sun dipped below the ridge outside her window, Clara looked out at the ballroom, now empty, chairs stacked, lights dimmed. She didn't feel forgotten. She felt framed, whole. It was late afternoon when Graham finally knocked. 2 quick raps, no rhythm, no pause. Clara had heard the elevator, the shuffle of his shoes down the corridor, the soft exhale before his hand met the door. She didn't rush to open it. Let him wait. Let the space between them be acknowledged. When she did answer, she didn't step back. She simply opened the door wide enough for him to see her, seated in her chair, the shawl draped over her shoulders like armor-worn light. "Hey," he said, eyes flicking around the room but never quite landing on her. "Graham?" she said with a nod. No invitation in her tone, just accuracy. He stood there, in his suit still slightly rumpled from the ceremony, boutonniere missing. He looked tired, or maybe just caught between relief and unfinished business. "I figured I should stop by," he said, "even just for a few minutes." Clara didn't offer tea, didn't gesture to the couch. "5 minutes is what you have," she said plainly. He stepped in, hands in his pockets, scanned the room as if trying to find his place in it, only to realize it had already been claimed. "I saw Ruth," he said. "She told me you hosted something last night." "I did." He hesitated. "I heard it went well." "It did." Silence wrapped around them, taut and expectant. "I guess you're mad," he offered finally, the apology implied but not spoken. Clara tilted her head not unkindly. "You're not even sure." He shifted, defensive. "You don't look mad. I'm not here to feed the story you told about me." That stopped him. He blinked. "What?" She leaned slightly forward. "The version of me you've been rehearsing in your head. The mother who demands too much, who overshadows your joy, who guilt trips and weeps and needs a part in everything. I won't play her. You wrote her, not me." Graham opened his mouth, then closed it. His face twitched with something between shame and confusion. "You didn't visit," she continued. "Not once. Not even when you used my name in your speech. Not even when you quoted me. That was meant to honor you." "No," Clara said, voice still gentle. "It was meant to perform me. You wanted the essence of me without the reality of me. A tribute, not a presence." His shoulders dropped. "I didn't know how to include you without complicating things." Clara smiled, just a flicker, sad and knowing. "I am complicated. So is love." Silence again. But this one felt different, deeper, honest. He looked down at his hands. "So what now?" Clara looked out the window, the sun bleeding gold across the tops of the pines. "Now you get to live with the choices you made. And I get to stop trying to be understood by someone who wasn't asking to understand." "You're not even mad?" he asked again, quieter this time, as if her lack of fury unnerved him more than any outburst might. "I have nothing left to spend anger on," Clara said. "Anger requires expectation, and I don't have any of those left either." The words landed not with malice but finality. He nodded once, slow. "I should go." "You already did," she said softly. He left without another word. No hug, no backward glance. When the door clicked shut, Clara didn't cry. She sat in the stillness, the clock ticking steady behind her, her body both light and weighted. That night, Ruth and Ray joined her on the back terrace where a small fire pit had been prepared. The venue director had arranged it as part of Clara's upcoming residency week, a quiet place to gather warmth. But Clara had something else in mind. She brought the trunk. It had been with her since she was 20. Olive green, metal corners, scuffed from moves and floods and decades. Inside, carefully folded beneath tissue that had yellowed with time, was her wedding dress. Ivory polyester, high neck, long sleeves. Her mother's idea of modest elegance. It had never fit her right, not in fabric or meaning. But she had kept it, believing maybe one day it would mean something different. She lifted it out and laid it across her lap. The fabric looked ghostly in the firelight. "Sure about this?" Ray asked. Clara nodded. "I don't need it," she said. "I've outgrown the story it came from." They watched as she placed the dress into the fire. It didn't catch all at once. It smoldered, then bloomed, flames curling around seams and hems, smoke rising in delicate spirals. The heat was gentle, not raging, like something finally allowed to rest. Clara sat close, watching it reduce to memory and ash. Ruth poured wine. Ray played music again, low and wistful. They didn't speak until the fire settled. Later, Clara returned to her suite, opened her journal, and wrote, "He came for 5 minutes, not to reconcile, but to verify the myth still stood. I let it fall. I didn't beg for closeness. I didn't offer forgiveness like currency. I stood in my own truth and let him exit it." Then she added, "I was a mother. I will always be. But I am also a woman, and she's writing her story now without waiting for anyone to read it." She closed the journal and looked across the room. In the mirror at the end of the hall, she saw herself, not the nurse, not the mother, not the figure edited into speeches. Just Clara, present, framed in her own light. The lawyer's office was quiet, tucked above a bookstore with light filtering in through linen curtains. Clara sat across from the desk, pen poised, her name already signed in slow, deliberate strokes across the updated documents. The will was simple now, streamlined, not out of spite but clarity. Graham's name remained, but only once, beside a single item listed under sentimental, not financial. Everything else, the property sale proceeds, retirement savings, personal belongings of value, was now allocated toward 2 foundations, one for women's centers in underserved areas, another for hospice and end-of-life care homes, places where compassion was often measured in whispered truths and weathered hands. She left the lawyer's office lighter than she'd arrived. The weight had not been grief. It had been the burden of holding space for someone who kept walking past it. Back in her suite, Clara prepared the box, small, navy velvet. Inside it, her old nursing pin, sterling, worn smooth at the edges, the same one she'd affixed to her collar every day for 37 years. It wasn't just a badge. It was a symbol of care, of showing up, of healing others even when she bled silently beneath her scrubs. She folded the note and tucked it inside. For when you learn to tend wounds instead of hide them. She sent it by courier, no return address. Let him wonder. Let the silence do what words could not. That night, the suite came alive once more, not with mourning or resentment, but the final act of reclamation. Ruth and Ray had transformed the room into a temporary sanctuary for stories. Women gathered again, some from the counter reception, others new, staff members, a few wedding guests who had heard rumors of something real happening far from the ballroom. They called it the telling, no microphones, no stage, just a circle of chairs and candlelight, a basket of prompts passed hand to hand. Tell me about a scar, tell me who saw you, tell me what you weren't allowed to say out loud. Clara opened the night. She didn't speak of Graham, or the wedding, or the omissions. She spoke of the patient who died holding her hand during the midnight shift in 1994, of the time she broke hospital protocol to sit with a woman estranged from her children, of the way grief looked different under fluorescent lights, of how care didn't require approval, just presence. Ray followed, recounting her decision not to have children. Ruth told the story of coming out at 48, not with an announcement, but by refusing to lie anymore. Laughter mixed with tears. The music stayed low. Ella again, Billy, a little Carol King. Someone brought peach cobbler from the kitchen. At the end, Clara passed out small cards with one question on each. What will you leave behind that no one can erase? As they left, each woman dropped her answer into a woven basket near the door. The room felt blessed, not by faith, but by honesty. The next morning, as Clara packed to leave the resort for her residency week, now shifted to a cottage beside the lake at Maya's offer, Ruth knocked, holding an envelope. "No sender," she said, "but it's for you." Clara opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, unfamiliar. "Dear Clara, you don't know me, but I was at the wedding. I'm Tessa's cousin, the one who wore the green dress and sat in the back. We spoke briefly at the elevator when no one else noticed you. I watched everything from the edges. I saw how they erased you, smoothed you out of the narrative. But I also saw how you refused to vanish. Thank you for showing me I'm not invisible. You made more impact from a recovery bed than their whole guest list combined. I hope to age like you, fully, unapologetically. With love, Celeste." Clara reread the letter twice, then folded it and placed it inside her journal. Not all legacies were written in bank ledgers. Some were scrawled on the backs of napkins, whispered between strangers, passed down not by blood but by boldness. And this one, this inheritance, was memory. Real, living, earned. The garden behind Arrow Glen was quiet in the morning light. dappled with soft shadows, dew still clinging to the petals like breath not yet spoken. Clara had chosen this hour deliberately, before the bustle, before the brunches, before anyone could mistake her stillness for waiting. The sapling stood in a canvas bag near the center of the lawn, a young magnolia, delicate but insistent. Its roots were bound but ready, like her. Ruth had arrived early, carrying a thermos of tea and a small wooden stool. Ray followed close behind with a folded blanket, a tin of fresh-baked biscuits, and a printed copy of the poem she'd spent all night refining. Neither asked what they were gathering for. They already knew. Clara stepped into the grass barefoot. The soil was damp and uneven, grounding. She let her toes sink just enough to feel the earth respond. This wasn't a ceremony in anyone else's name. Not Graham's, not David's, not her mother's. This was hers. She had dressed simply, linen pants, her softest blouse, a shawl that once belonged to her grandmother. Her hair was pulled back in a loose twist, silver glinting in the sun. No makeup, no performance. The RSVP card was tucked into her journal, edges curled, unopened by choice. She'd held onto it all week, not from sentimentality, but as a marker of what she hadn't signed up for. Now she knelt at the hole Ray had already helped dig, a modest space carved out between two benches, framed by rosemary and lavender. Clara placed the sapling inside, her fingers gentle around its roots. As she covered it with soil, she whispered names, not aloud, but in her chest. Names of women she'd worked beside, cried with, buried and celebrated. Names that had vanished from dinner tables and family group texts because they were too strong or too complicated or too tired to pretend. When she finished, Ray stepped forward with her paper. She didn't read with drama, just quiet strength. For the women who mothered strangers, who fed without applause, who held secrets and spines in equal measure, who were told they were too much or not enough, whose names aren't spoken in speeches, but live on in the bones of those they carried. This is for you. For us. Clara stood, wiping her hands on her pants, heart pounding with something that wasn't anger or sorrow, something closer to truth unburdened. Ruth didn't speak. She only began to hum. A lullaby, one Clara hadn't heard aloud in years, but had hummed to herself during endless ER nights, when a child wouldn't stop crying, when machines beeped their cold warnings, when she changed bedpans at 3 a.m. and whispered songs to no one. It rose soft and low into the air. Clara closed her eyes, and then she reached into her journal, pulled out the RSVP card, and let it go. The breeze was light, but it caught quickly, lifting the card with gentle fingers. It floated upward, spun once, and disappeared past the hedge. She watched it go without regret. This was never revenge. She stepped back, looking at the sapling, now swaying slightly with the wind. This was remembrance, not just of the daughter, not just of the nurse, not even of the mother, of Clara, by Clara. She turned to Ruth and Ray, arms wide. "Thank you," she said, voice steady but thick, "for standing in the truth with me." Ray hugged her fiercely, dirt and all. Ruth just nodded and whispered, "You don't owe anyone absence to be respected." As they walked back toward the venue, the sun broke fully through the trees, casting long lines of light across the garden. The sapling shimmered where it stood, not a symbol of starting over, but of growing, regardless. And behind her in the soft earth, her footprint lingered, proof that she had been there, present, planted, framed not by others but by her own hands. The sun was already warming the stone path outside Arrow Glen by the time Clara checked out. The front desk clerk, a young woman with bright eyes and a practiced smile, tried to make small talk, offering apologies she hadn't been asked for. Clara only offered a kind nod. "You've been very kind," she said. Then she placed the sealed envelope on the counter, her handwriting looping across the front with precision. For Graham Langston. No forwarding needed. The envelope was thick, not with pages of anger or confession, but with clarity. Inside was a single-page letter. No accusations, no pleas, just closure. And beneath it, a printed copy of her favorite passage from her memoir in progress, underlined. He didn't forget the date. He just never learned how to share a story that wasn't about him. She didn't wait for the clerk's reaction. She turned and walked toward the doors, one hand gripping the cane Ray had insisted she bring. Her gait was slow but sure, her suitcase rolled behind her like an afterthought. Outside, the air was crisp, fresh from the night's rain. Everything smelled of pine and second chances. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The car was already waiting, packed with Ruth and Ray's parting gifts, a thermos of ginger tea, a new leather-bound journal, and a copy of her speaking itinerary, neatly printed and tabbed. The first engagement was in 3 weeks, a local conference on elder dignity and generational caregiving. Clara would be their keynote speaker. She hadn't said yes for applause. She said yes because there were too many like her. Women airbrushed out of their family albums, handed silence in place of thanks, made invisible in the name of moving forward. The venue shrank behind her as the car pulled away, just another building. No longer a monument to grief. 3 weeks later, she stood backstage at a community auditorium in Santa Rosa, watching the house lights dim and the murmurs rise. The room was filled with nurses, social workers, caretakers, and sons and daughters who knew the weight of regret, some bearing it, some causing it. She had her notes, but she didn't look at them. She adjusted the mic when she stepped onto the stage. The spotlight didn't blind her. She smiled, small and steady. "I didn't crash his wedding," she said into the mic, her voice even and warm. "I claimed my worth." The audience was still, waiting. She leaned in just slightly. "And if we don't start naming what's been erased, we'll raise another generation of storytellers who don't know how to share the mic." She paused, letting that truth settle. Then she told them everything, not in detail, not in drama, but in direction. She spoke of choices, of silence, of the power in not being invited, but showing up anyway, of love that should be tender, not transactional, of how you can survive being left out and still never disappear. And when she finished, they stood for her. Not out of pity, not because she had suffered, but because she had reclaimed the space her absence tried to swallow. Backstage, she sat for a moment, cane across her lap, palms open. Someone handed her a bottle of water. Someone else said, "You reminded me of my grandmother." She smiled again. The next stop was a retreat center in Seattle, then a university panel, then a women's circle in rural Oregon. The stories would keep coming, and she would keep answering. Because Clara Langston was no longer waiting to be invited into the narrative. She was writing it, speaking it, framing it in full. And this time, she wouldn't be edited out. If you've ever felt sidelined in someone else's celebration, this story was written for you. Not every legacy comes with applause, but some are carved quietly in resilience. Honor the women who show up without being asked. Pass the story on, because remembrance is a revolution. And silence? That's the only thing we're done accepting.